Hello, I'm Joel Woodruff, president of the C.S. Lewis Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event titled A Christian Response to Antisemitism with Darrell Bach, Randy Newman, and Tom Terrence. For those not familiar with the C.S. Lewis Institute, CSLI was founded 48 years ago as a servant ministry to the church for the purpose of helping develop disciples of Jesus Christ who articulate, defend, share, and live their faith in personal and public life. Our Heart and Mind Discipleship Ministry now has 17 locations in the United States, Canada, and Northern Ireland, and people around the world download and use the small group resources, articles, audio and video materials, and podcasts available through our award-winning website. Our flagship program, the year-long, tuition-free C.S. Lewis Fellows Program, has equipped thousands of men and women to date to become effective disciples of Jesus Christ. The program includes Bible study, lectures, mentoring, small groups, and training in spiritual formation, discipleship, conversational apologetics, and evangelism to develop servant leaders for the workplace, church, and home. And it's designed so that even busy working professionals can complete the program while maintaining their work, church, and family life. The C.S. Lewis Fellows Program is offered in the following locations: Annapolis, Maryland; Atlanta; Belfast, Northern Ireland; Central Pennsylvania; Chicago; Charlotte, North Carolina; Cincinnati; Dallas; Greenville, South Carolina; Loudoun County, Virginia; Naples, Florida; Northeast Ohio; Virginia Beach; Seattle; Toronto, Ontario; and Washington, D.C. If you live in one of these areas and would like more information on this program for men and women ages 24 to 94, please check our website under Fellows Program. The 23-24 class application period will open on February 1st. If you haven't yet subscribed to receive our free digital discipleship resources and announcements about upcoming events like this one, I encourage you to do that as well. You can click on the chat room button at the bottom of your screen to find links to CSLI resources and our website. Now would you please join me in prayer? Heavenly Father, I thank you for the opportunity to discuss this important topic of anti-Semitism and a Christian response to it. Pray that you would speak through our guests and our panel, and may you just help us to be able to find your wisdom and truth during this time. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. The topic for our panel discussion, a Christian response to anti-Semitism, is one that I'd hoped we'd never need to address. It's a challenging and difficult topic to discuss, especially given the current world in which we live. Today, the media can take anything and everything and make it a political issue and use it to divide us rather than unify us. As well, the virtue of civility and the ability to agree to disagree seems almost non-existent in a cancel culture. Words are taken out of context, and often words are given new definitions to undermine or exaggerate the other side's position. That all being said, we believe it our Christian duty to do our best to provide a thoughtful, biblical, and a Christian response to the sin of anti-Semitism, which has reared its ugly head again in our world. While people may try to interpret our words politically, we're not here to discuss politics or even public policy. We'll not be getting into the current situation regarding Israel and Hamas, controversies on university campuses, or other contemporary issues. We will, however, regardless of your political leanings, encourage you to pray for all parties involved in conflicts around the world, and that is a command given to us by our Lord. As well, when it comes to dealing with injustice, hatred, bigotry, and prejudice, we can find it in every corner of the world. It's part of living on a fallen planet. By focusing on the sin of anti-Semitism, we're not negating nor denying that there are many other forms of racism and injustice that need to be addressed. However, since the Jewish people have made such an impact on the monotheistic religions of the world and are an essential part of the story we have as Christians, we've chose to focus our discussion to dealing with this area of anti-Semitism, which has been in existence for over 3,000 years. Our discussion is going to focus on the history of anti-Semitism, beginning from the biblical period through today, the tropes, myths, and false teachings used to promote it, and current anti-Semitic trends. This will be followed with some suggested ways in which Christians can lovingly, thoughtfully, and truthfully respond to anti-Semitism. In trying to wrestle with this topic, I can't think of a better panel of experts to bring together than we have on this broadcast. It's my pleasure to introduce them to you. First of all, we have Dr. Darrell Bach. Darrell is the Executive Director of Cultural Engagement and Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, Texas. Professor Bach is the author of over 40 books, including well-regarded commentaries on Luke and Acts, and also the bestseller Breaking the Da Vinci Code. He's a graduate of the University of Texas, Dallas Theological Seminary, and has his doctorate from the University of Aberdeen. He's a consulting editor for Christianity Today and serves on the boards of Wheaton College and Chosen People Ministries. Darrell, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Next, we have Dr. Randy Newman. Randy is a senior fellow for apologetics and evangelism at the C.S. Lewis Institute. He's taught at several evangelical seminaries, and after serving for over 30 years with Cru, he established Connection Points, a ministry to help Christians engage people's hearts the way Jesus did. He's written 6 books, including the bestseller Questioning Evangelism and Engaging with Jewish People, Understanding the World, Sharing Good News. He has an MDiv and a PhD in Intercultural Studies from Trinity International University. Randy, thank you for being with us.
I'm very grateful to be here. Thanks.
And finally, we have Dr. Tom Terrence. Tom is President Emeritus of the C.S. Lewis Institute, where he helped launch many of the Institute's publications and the flagship C.S. Lewis Fellows Program, which equips men and women to live wholeheartedly for Christ. Tom's an ordained minister and a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, spends his time writing, mentoring, and consulting, and his amazing life story is told in the book, Consumed by Hate, Redeemed by Love. Has a Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry degree in Christian spirituality. Tom, thank you for being a part of our panel.
Thank you for having me.
Our panel discussion is titled, A Christian Response to Antisemitism. And in order to address the topic, it would be first good to know what we mean by the term anti-Semitism. Maybe, Darrell, you want to give a shot first at how you would define anti-Semitism?
Well, this isn't my definition. It's a definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And it says anti-Semitism is hostility, prejudice, or discrimination against Jewish people. It's a form of racism, and it is usually directed either against individuals, property, Jewish communities, and or religious facilities. It involves a certain perception of Jewish people leading to the hatred of the Jewish people, and it tends to accuse Jewish people of devious means to achieve malevolent ends, and so it's a combination of religious hatred and cultural disdain.
Well, thank you. Randy or Tom, do you have anything to add to that or any other thoughts on that?
Well, I think I would like to add, just again, since we're saying this is a Christian response, I think we do need to see there's a supernatural element, I think, to anti-Semitism. It's like other racisms and prejudices, and yet there's an extremity to it that just comes across as irrational and almost crazy. And as Christians, we recognize there is a devil, and he injects his unique form of insanity into this. So there's an intensity to it that's it's not just like other racisms. There seems to be a spiritual component, and we'll explore that more later on. But I just think at this early stage we want to at least acknowledge there's a flavor to it that has demonic overtones to it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you for that, Randy. Tom, anything else you'd like to share?
I think Darrell and Randy have covered it quite well.
Oh, good. Well, you talked to Randy just about this idea of the intensity of it. It is interesting. Let me just share a few statistics with you. Currently, in the world, there are approximately 2.38 billion people who call themselves Christians, 1.9 billion people who identify as Muslim, 1.2 billion people consider themselves Hindu, and yet only 16.2 million people who would be identified as Jewish. So thus, out of a population of 8.1 billion people, the Jewish people represent only 0.2% of all the people in the world, a relatively small group of people when you compare it to other people groups. And so That's quite interesting. We talk about the intensity of it coming against such a small group of people in the world. As well, there's over 51 Muslim majority nations, 96 secular nations, which have a wide variety of religions represented, and only one Jewish nation, the state of Israel. So, for such a small people group, one could argue, yes, they do receive a disproportionate amount of focus in the news, and one might ask the question, why is this, and what makes a person Jewish? I guess it's a good place to start. Who is Jewish? How do you become a Jewish person? Randy, you'd like to start us with that?
Um, well, I guess I want to begin by saying I'm one of those Jewish people. So that wasn't mentioned in my bio, but I came to faith in Jesus as the Messiah, coming out of a Jewish background, raised in a Jewish family, attending synagogue. The topic of who is a Jewish person, who is a Jew, it's, believe it or not, it's rather complex and debated. But I think it's fair to say that it's person is Jewish if they are a physical descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Jewish community has wrestled with, how do we define this? At one point, they said, well, if your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. But some of that was a response to some terrible, terrible persecution and the vast number of Jewish women who were raped by Gentile men. So that's why that came. But I think it's safe of saying it's a person who's a physical descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So much more we could say, but I'll stop at that point.
Yeah, Daryl or Tom, like to add to that?
Well, since everyone is kind of saying what their background is, I'm also of Jewish background. Both my parents were Jewish, but I didn't know I was Jewish until I was 13. One day, my uncle showed up. Our family had been isolated when my parents decided they were not only going to be practicing Jews. And one day, my uncle showed up with these three kids, and they talked about going to synagogue. And I didn't know much theology, but I knew a synagogue wasn't a church. And so I asked my family, what's going on here? Because I was about 13 at the time, and they told me our family background. So I come from a Jewish background. A Jewish person, as Randy says, is someone who is descended from what we might affectionately call, in biblical terms, the patriarchs, and and it also represents it. People are Jewish. There are a lot of what are called secular Jews, so they're descended from Abraham, but they aren't necessarily going to synagogue on a regular basis. But even some secular Jews engage in some practices that are particularly Jewish, that are related to the background of their faith. So it's kind of a mixture of both descent and then, in some cases, I'll say, ethical and or religious orientation that is rooted in Jewish practice.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. Well, I think that helps us in thinking about that. So, this particular discussion is looking at a Christian response to anti-Semitism. What kind of ties does the Christian faith have to the Jewish people? Daryl, do you want to start us there?
Well, I mean, the simplest answer to that question is just think through what we call the Old Testament. But and of course, it wasn't called an Old Testament until there was a New Testament. You put Jesus in that mix. There was no New Testament when Jesus came. There was only what we call the Old Testament, which is actually the Hebrew Scripture. Now, I made that more complicated than it's supposed to be. But basically, all the roots of the theological expression that Jesus came, he came to the people of Israel, he came to offer himself as their Messiah, etc. The roots, the ethics, the wisdom that comes out of the Hebrew Scriptures fed into and really forms a base. The promises made to the patriarchs, etc., are the base of what led into and became a part of the Christian faith. So we have much, maybe even almost everything to owe to the background of Judaism. Jesus himself grew up in a Jewish context as a child of Jews. His genealogies go back to Abraham, no matter whether you read in Matthew or Luke. You can't understand most of the New Testament. You don't understand a little bit about Judaism of the first century. So it's kind of everywhere in terms of background and influence.
Mm-hmm. Tom or Randy, like to add to that, how our Christian faith relates to Judaism?
Jesus, a lot of times people think of Jesus as being the first Christian, but Jesus wasn't a Christian. He was a Jew, and we need to recognize that, just like all the apostles and the scriptures that they read, the early church read. I mean, we have so much legacy from the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish people that, we're grafted on. As Gentiles are grafted on. And we need to bear that in mind, but most of us don't think of it that way. But it's helpful to get our minds oriented around biblical perspective instead of cultural ideas.
So I guess the question is, what does the Christian faith have, or how is it tied to the Jewish people? I guess I would just want to point out, God chose the nation of Israel to be the object of His plan, and that plan was that then they would be a light to the Gentiles, and so there's God's choosing, not because they were worthy of it, not because they were sinless or perfect or even better. God chose them because God chose them. And then they are a light to the Gentiles of a message that none of us are worthy to be chosen or called by God. And yet, that's the connection that we have to this God. It's by grace. And so a Christian response to anti-Semitism is we're not saying Jewish people are better than others or more important, but they do have a distinct and unique role in God's plan. And we may differ about how that plays out in the future, but I think all Christians have to look to the scriptures and say God chose the Jewish people and He has a unique plan for them, and there will be a plan, a role they play in the future also of God's plan. So all that to say is we shouldn't be surprised if the devil wants to attack that. If they have a unique place in God's plan, they have a unique place in the devil's plan as well.
So let me flip this a little bit and say it this way. Imagine what our world would be like if we didn't have the Psalms. Imagine what our world would be like if we didn't have Proverbs. Imagine what our world would be like if we didn't have the teaching of the prophets. You start to pull out what's in the Hebrew scripture and say, if that wasn't part of our world, what would fill that vacuum? Or say it the other way around, because we have those things, our world has had certain perspectives that have driven much of the world's thinking for a long period of time, that have set kind of the ethical boundaries and relational boundaries for people over the centuries. And that wisdom, that worship, that focus on the fact that there is one God, which was unique at the time of Judaism, all are features that have flooded the thinking of the world, and the world is better off for it.
Yes, that's a powerful reminder. 10 Commandments in law, basic law, and all the things that many people take for granted coming out of the Jews and their story in Scripture. No, thank you for sharing that. Since we're talking a little bit about Scripture, it might seem like an odd place to go, but it's my understanding that the history of anti-Semitism actually can be found first in the Bible, and it's there where we begin to see examples of anti-Semitism. Perhaps can you all share your understanding of how anti-Semitism began, looking at the Hebrew Scriptures? What can we learn from those particular examples and passages? Randy, you'd like to start on this one?
I know we have the book of Esther, and it's this remarkable display of hatred. So, I mean, to the point of Haman wanting to totally annihilate all the Jewish people and making a pretty elaborate plan to do so. But I'm I'm quite sure that's not the first place it shows up, but I'm blanking out as to where earlier. Can one of you
Well,
help me with that?
I'll start in the Exodus with Egypt making Israel nothing but a group of slaves.
There we go. Thank you.
That's a good starting point. You move outside the scripture, you've got a period of the Maccabees and the Maccabean War, which was Antiochus Epiphanes' attempt to, I would say, placate Judaism and remove her religious distinctives. You know, they tried to outlaw the Torah. They wanted to confiscate the Hebrew scripture of the time, that kind of thing. And in fact, had Judaism not survived the Maccabean War, Judaism might not exist today. So that's why they celebrate Hanukkah. Um, and then, of course, most people are very familiar with the Holocaust as probably the most recent grand example of anti-Semitism. And then there have been times in between, particularly in Spain and in other parts of the world, where the Jews were persecuted for being the murderers of Christ and that kind of thing. I think we're going to come back to that conversation a little later. So it's literally run through the history. It's centuries old. It tends to be, I'm going to use a crass image to describe it, tends to be a little bit like whack-a-mole. Okay, it's up and you bang it and it goes down and it's kind of calm for a while and then boom, it pops up again. And I think that's the way it often shows up for a period, and then we start to talk about it, get sensitive to it, it settles down, and then boom, it pops up again.
Yeah, and so I guess if we go all the way back to the Exodus, that's depending on dating, at least over 3,000 years old, the first, at least written accounts of some form of anti-Semitism. And then Esther, we've mentioned, and in the intertestamental period, the Hasmonean revolt, and what we celebrate today is Hanukkah, kind of those Old and New Testament periods. I know Jesus, of course, celebrated Hanukkah in John 10, I think Feast of Dedication is mentioned. What would you say, looking at the biblical history anyway, from the Exodus all the way through early New Testament period, what would be the traits or I guess, what did anti-Semitism look like? What were the kind of the things behind it in that period of time? Any thoughts?
Well, I think the starting point for it was the fact that Israel had the only monotheistic religion in the world. And with it came a series of practices that were very different. They had a different diet. They only worshiped at one temple. They had laws of purity, et cetera. There was just a whole cultural conglomeration of things that made them different, that made them, if I can say it this way, other. And in doing that, that distinctiveness, which marked them out and which said, this is a part of who we are, this is our identity, this is how we worship our God, marked them out as separate from everybody else, and that produced a reaction, and a pretty consistent one to try and, if possible, remove those distinctions. You know, there's a really interesting sociological principle at work here in how you deal with a culture that's different than your own when you're the controlling government in the region. And there really were two policies in the ancient world. The Babylonians tried to assimilate everyone and make everyone as Babylonian as they could possibly be. The Persians, on the other hand, said, you can have your religion and your practices and be distinctive as long as you don't infringe on the rights of the state. And so those two forms of dealing with Judaism exist in the Old Testament, And this is why, generally speaking, say a ruler like Cyrus comes off much more positively than the rulers of Babylon, because they gave Judaism and Jews the room to be Jewish, and didn't try to impose on them this kind of assimilation that at the same time would wipe out their distinctives.
I'd like to add. So the Jewish people had monotheism, and with that came these entailments of morality.
Mm-hmm.
So adultery is wrong, and all sorts of things are wrong. And in a culture that doesn't want to have an authority telling them what's right and what's wrong, there's a lot of rebellion against it. So I'm thinking of two places in the New Testament where In John 3, I think it's John 3, I really hope it is, where Jesus talks about light coming in, but darkness rejected it because people loved the darkness. And that's an important piece for us to remember, that there's this fallen human nature that loves darkness, that loves rebellion, that loves sin. And so any people that say, no, this is right and this is wrong, are going to be persecuted. And that is why Christians today are persecuted. I'm also thinking of another place. I just find this so intriguing. But in Luke 22, when they come to arrest Jesus, and you remember there's that moment where Peter attacks the guy and cuts off his ear, and then Jesus heals the man. In Luke 22, beginning in verse 52, Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is the hour when darkness reigns. And you see the rest of what happens in the gospel. I mean, it seems crazy. It's like, why are they arresting him? He didn't do anything, and why are they crucifying him? There's sort of this super spiritual craziness going on. And he said, well, this is the hour when darkness reigns. And I think that that's a piece that we need to remember of why is it that the Jewish people have been objects of anti-Semitic persecution? Well, even for Jewish people who deny that, they don't believe that stuff, they represent this Torah, law of God, that says some things are right and some things are wrong.
And just to piggyback on that, the idea of holiness and the morality that comes with it is extremely important. Contrast that with the religious environment of Israel's neighbors, who had gods, but the gods were a lot like humans. They behaved like humans. They made, if I can say this, good and bad choices like humans do, etc. There wasn't the standard of holiness that came with the faith that was guiding and directing people. The gods were as capricious as the worshipers were, and so that sets a tone for the way society lives and responds. And we actually have a variation of that today. We don't have necessarily a lot of gods and thinking about the way gods act, but we have a lot of independence from God that allows us to go in whatever direction we want, and we're inclined to do that kind of thing. And the core sin is this belief that we're independent from the Creator God, so, and don't have a need for a relationship with Him. So this is as different as our times are from ancient times. They're not that different.
That's a good point. I think we can certainly see that, and that Judaism was very distinctive from the culture, and of course in the early church, most of the early Christians were Jewish, and the same morality really applied from Judaism into early Christianity. So the Christians were persecuted, early Christians who were many Jews, persecuted for many of the same reasons as the Jewish people by the culture and by the prevailing climate. So that being set apart part is interesting to note. Now, as we look at our New Testament as Christians, I mean, the writings in the Testament we've already talked about were written actually, again, even the New Testament were written by Jewish people. Paul, Peter, all the writers of the New Testament were Jewish. And so the writings of the Gospels and the letters, I think as Christians are obviously helpful to us and lead us in our faith. And yet, throughout the church history, there have been many people who have looked at the New Testament and have found it to be something which they felt has led to anti-Semitic ideas within the church. For instance, there's the accusation that the Jews killed Jesus. Can you address this idea that the New Testament is anti-Semitic? Where does that come from? Daryl, could you start us there?
Yeah, well, again, the interesting observation here is, except for perhaps Luke, every writer in the New Testament is Jewish. And so this is Jews talking about themselves, about their own promises, their own commitments. And so I tell people, we don't accuse Isaiah or Jeremiah of being anti-Semitic because they're critical of Israel. No, they're engaged in a prophetic critique of the nation and thinking through that. Now, there is a very specific passage that often comes up in this conversation. It's in Matthew 27:25, when Jesus is being crucified, and the crowd that chooses Jesus over Barabbas to be crucified says, "Let his blood be upon us and upon our children." And so that is seen as a curse that that Judaism, the Jewish people who rejected Jesus, put on themselves as a result of their choice of sending Jesus to the cross. And then that text was used for a long time in inappropriate ways to blame the Jewish people as a whole for the crucifixion of Jesus, and then to respond to Jewish people sometimes in hostility and violence out of that. That's part of the history of anti-Semitism, and particularly in European history. And my response to that is that actually what they are saying is we're responsible for this choice that we've made. It's not so much a curse as it is a recognition of responsibility. We have made this choice. It's an expression of at least a group of people, not all Jews, but a group of Jews who have rejected the idea that Jesus is the Messiah. And we say, we will take the responsibility for ourselves for having made this decision. So I think sometimes that passage is very much misread. And then another text that oftentimes come up, or a group of texts, comes up out of John's gospel that refer generically to the Jews almost consistently as opponents to Jesus, etc. And that's sometimes said to be anti-Semitic. It really is John's really talking about the Jewish leadership. Those are the people making the decisions all the way through. And so even though he uses a generic term, he's using it very specifically about a certain group. And we need to just remind ourselves, as has already been noted, all the early Christians of the first generation, almost without exception, were Jewish. We didn't get to the Gentile expansion and involvement in Christianity till the missions that went out for outside of Israel into Gentile territory, etc. So the very first generation of Christians were Jewish. In fact, I like to say it this way because I write about Acts, and that is one of the burdens of Acts is to argue that Christianity didn't intentionally become a separate religion. It was forced to become separate because our apostles went into the synagogues and said, Jesus is the fulfillment of the promises made to the patriarchs. And the bulk of Jewish people said, no, that's not true. And so they were forced to become separate. And Acts tells that story of how that happened. And actually, Acts is arguing, we may look like the new boy on the block, but we're actually quite old. We're rooted in promises made to the patriarchs centuries ago. And in the ancient world, a religion had its value from its legacy and from its length and its history and its experience. It isn't like our world where the new thing is the best. And so all those things go into this kind of a conversation. And the New Testament is not anti-Semitic. It is prophetic. It is self-critical. It's absolutely self-critical, but it's not anti-Semitic.
If I may, I don't remember where I heard this first, but well, let me give a backdrop of friends of mine in high school gave me a copy of the New Testament to read, and I did not want to touch that thing. And my rabbi at my synagogue had made the case many, many times that the New Testament is an anti-Semitic book. And tragically, some Christians have viewed it that way. And so Martin Luther said some really terrible things. I mean, there's a long history of really disgusting things where people have used the New Testament to back up or give validity to anti-Semitism. There's a whole very, very painful book by Michael Brown called Our Hands Are Stained with Blood. And it's difficult to read, but it's difficult to deny. So, I mean, I was warned against reading that book, but when I did finally read it, I thought, this doesn't sound anti-Semitic. It sounds a lot like the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures. It sounds very similar. And then I remember hearing someone say once, well, if the New Testament is anti-Semitic, the Old Testament is far worse. because, like Daryl pointed out, the prophets. I mean, my goodness, they didn't mince words. They said some really, really terrible things about Jewish people who were not living the way God called them to live. But I don't think it's fair to say that either one of them is anti-Semitic. But if the New Testament is, the Old Testament seems even worse. Um, I hope this is okay. But Tom, I'm wondering if you can tell just a little bit of your story, because you tell it beautifully and powerfully and painfully in your book. But there were things that were very appealing to you in your life before becoming a Christian that led you to really embrace anti-Semitism. And there was a kind of logic to it that's bad logic, but it's very attractive, I think.
Yes, well, it's a sad chapter in my life, to be sure. Um, I was, like a lot of people coming into this anti-Semitism today, young, not developed in critical thinking, and immersed in a culture that was hospitable to this type of thinking. And I actually, speaking of the demonic, I think that was part of what was involved with me going down that rabbit hole, as they say nowadays. Um, but I think it started, as I look back, with um, a neighbor of my grandmother's. I spent a fair amount of time at her house when I was growing up, and he was a little older than I was, and he did not like Jews. And he had some recordings, some records back in those days. It was the vinyl records at 78 LP.
You're dating yourself. Hang in there.
Yes. But they were the recorded speeches of Hitler. And of course, I didn't speak German, but he wanted to sit down and listen to those speeches of Hitler. And those speeches had an effect on me that I can't really account for. Something happened, and listening to that, it just had a captivating influence. And this would be strange for me because when I was just a little kid, like I think the second grade, a couple of Jewish girls in the class, I thought they were cool and liked them, and I had nothing against Jewish people. But this brought a turn in my thinking. And then as I grew a little bit older, um, the whole civil rights movement came to the forefront of attention in the South, where I was raised in Mobile, Alabama. And it was a populist kind of revolt in some ways, smaller scale, led by Governor George Wallace and others like him. And part of this involved, and Wallace didn't push anti-Semitism, but a lot of people who liked Wallace did. The idea was, okay, as Southerners, being forced to desegregate our public schools. We think that's a terrible idea, and we think it's really terrible that the federal government wants to step in and violate our states' rights. And what is behind this whole civil rights movement anyway? And of course, the answer was, well, actually, the communists are behind this. This is one of their projects. They are inspiring and stirring up all this trouble. And in the 60s, communism was a great fear and a big issue in America. And then the conversation went a step back even more. And if you wanted to get the real insight, the Jews were ultimately behind the communists. These Jews, they are the ultimate culprits. And the attitude toward Jews was not positive. Like in Mobile, Jews couldn't join the Mobile Country Club where the elites, the white Gentiles went. They had to start their own country club. But you could go to either place. You couldn't tell who was a Jew and who was a Gentile. They looked identical, you know. But it was that kind of anti-Semitism that was sort of baked into the culture. And the attitudes toward Jewish people were, oh, they're clannish, they're greedy, deceitful, manipulative, they're power hungry, that sort of thing. And as I began to read some of this anti Semitic literature, I saw, oh, yeah, they're conspiring to control the world through the United Nations and various other means. They're in charge and controlling back behind the scenes the media and banking and finance and politics. And they're behind all of these things, but they keep their hands hidden. And they are the arch conspirators. And then I came into possession of a book called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. And boy, that was supposed to really put you in touch with the heart and soul of this great conspiracy. And allegedly, the minutes of meetings of great Jewish leaders back a century earlier and their plots and plans and schemes to take over the world. So that did a real number on me. It really brought a kind of a change of worldview. And whereas I didn't start off in life hating Jews, but as I absorbed this kind of thinking uncritically, fear rose up, and then fear produced anger, and on I could go. But I became very anti-Semitic and thought it was perfectly right to hate Jews and want to see them driven out. And it's just so crazy, though, because there's no truth to it. That's the problem. The way I got out of this was through searching for truth. It wasn't that somebody came to me and said, well, let me explain the facts. People tried that, but it had no effect whatsoever. I was totally immune to any kind of logical or rational analysis because, of course, the Jews controlled the publishing houses. So you can't believe what you read in the books. It's just like a schizophrenic kind of delusional world, paranoid schizophrenia, self-induced. That may sound like a bizarre story, but it's happening all over the place.
I have.
It's effective, especially effective today, because back when I got in it, it started off with some flyers distributed around my high school. Now what's happening is that it has gone to the internet, and these anti-Semitic and far-right groups have coalesced internationally. And this stuff is all over the internet, and it's using music. It's using all kinds of means of drawing in younger people, just like I was, not critical thinkers yet, and indoctrinating them, and then radicalizing them. And it's all built on lies. But people don't seek truth.
Yeah, just to confirm this, when I was dating my wife, and then after we got married, I had, I guess you call him an uncle-in-law. I don't know if I've ever heard that phrase before, but anyway, that's what he was, an uncle on my wife's side, who was a member of the John Birch Society. I remember being I don't remember if it was Christmas or Thanksgiving, but one of our holiday family gatherings. I'm in the corner of a room, and he's he's telling me all these conspiracies and how he sees the world, etc. And you're right, Tom. The things that I was hearing in the 1970s and early 1980s are not very different from what I hear about going on the internet today. That's the same stories. I mean, there's just a little longer history that's attached to it, or alleged history that's attached to it. And the whole thing is designed to have people view Jewish people askance. And that's the core definition of what anti-Semitism is: to create a prejudice against a certain people just because they come from a certain background. And then this is designed to reinforce that perception and to justify it, which is the sad part of it.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think, some of the I don't know, accusations against the Jews. For instance, one that they're greedy because supposedly they control the banking world. But can you speak to some of those myths or legend, and maybe even why the Jews were even handling the banks in the Middle Ages, for example? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't done enough research on this to give a lot of facts and figures, but um, yes, Jewish people have had tremendous influence, and I think it's because God has chosen to bless the Jewish people. But I want to quickly add, we haven't really been as influential as people think we are. I mean, yeah, I guess Jewish people are involved in banking. They're not the only ones. And, in Hollywood, they're not the only ones. I mean, if you just do a little bit of research and, okay, yeah, they're involved in some influential places. We don't quite have this dominance that people think we do. And I think that's part of the lie of, they control this and they control that. I just don't think there's facts and numbers to back that up.
The one other element that might be a part of this is that the Jewish people historically have been highly literate people. They are people, they're people of the book in one sense. They're trained with a community that had rabbis alongside of them to instruct the people in the book and to make them highly literate people. And so their literacy and their value on education and on understanding what's going on around them, the fact that they were a minority and had to cope with that as well. All those things contributed to their, I'll say, cultural alacrity that they were able to form as a minority people, and they had to be effective. And sometimes you'll hear this from a variety of minorities, not just Jewish people, but is to say, in order to survive, we have to be better than the average person. And the pursuit of that meant that there was a pursuit of a standard that in the end, I guess, paid off. I mean, it made them effective in the communities in which they functioned, and made them effective as citizens. And so they came to have prominence in a lot of ways because they came out of a culture that valued literacy.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and just that striving when you are a minority, just to overcome and to continue to push ahead. I was thinking too in the Middle Ages. My understanding that the medieval church interpreted the idea of charging interest as something Christians shouldn't do. So they handed the banking industry over to the Jews, thinking, well, the Jews can charge interest. We'll invest in those banks, but we aren't allowed to charge interest ourselves. So some Jews do get involved in banking. As well, my understanding is that during the Black Plague, when millions of people were dying due to this disease, which turns out the disease was spread by rats. Jews kept kosher homes. They were cleanly, kept things clean, and so the spread of germs was less among the Jewish population. So more Gentiles, you might say, or Christians died because they were just not cleaning their houses, to be frank. And so as a result, they blamed the Black Plague on the Jews, for example. Those are some things that I'd I think historically have been just little things that have been myths that spread, but it was just because of just the way they lived their lives, and it wasn't due to any, again, conspiracy theory. And I think the elders of the Protocols of Zion you mentioned, Tom, it's a good one to look back on. It was actually written, I think, I believe, in Russia. At a time when they were trying to find someone to blame for some of the problems in Russia. And so it was a totally false narrative written to blame everything on the Jews. And unfortunately, that Protocols of the Elders of Zion continues to this day to be believed as some true document. So I think there are some things from the past, and I think it's good to at least be aware of some of those ideas that have circulated. You're right, Tom. It's irrational. These ideas are not based on truth. So again, I guess coming back to truth is important. But unfortunately, I think, Randy, you mentioned earlier too, the church, unfortunately, throughout history, the Christian church has been, I'd say, institutional church, guilty of anti-Semitism throughout history. I think you mentioned Martin Luther, who unfortunately wrote a terrible tract against the Jews, and others. What can we learn from, I guess, the history of the church, from the bad examples, and what can we learn from any good examples in the church over the years, and the way in which Christians have related with the Jewish people?
Well, Joel, before we talk about that, it might be helpful to name some names. We talked about Luther, but what about Augustine and Chrysostom and some of our greatest heroes? You know, people as good and brilliant and all the rest being drawn into some of these ideas. I mean, there's a long history of this. It's not like the Jews are just making up something when they say the Christians
Yeah, the more
have
the more the
persecuted
church
them,
became isolated from its Jewish roots, the more likely this was to pop up and to manifest itself. And that's something also that the history very definitely shows.
Yeah, any other names or examples where we've seen this in the church cropping up? Randy, do you have any other names, or Tom? Or
None are coming to mind at the moment, but if it's okay, I want to go to a more theological place of, here's the way I want to express it. It's easy to miss the gospel, or it's easy to lose the gospel. It's easy to forget it's all by grace. It's God's mercy. He sent his son to die for sinful people who didn't deserve it. And we lose sight of that. We have the whole book of Galatians in the New Testament to try to say, wait a minute, you've lost the gospel. You're preaching another gospel, which is no gospel at all. And so in the New Testament itself, in the book of Acts, and then in history, we have numerous places where we lost sight of the gospel. We lost sight of the grace of the gospel. And when you do that, you start seeing yourself as, well, I'm worthy of God's love and other people are not. And when you get into that mode, there's all sorts of horrible things that flow out of it. And so anti-Semitism is one of them. But I mean, it's a million varieties of self-righteousness. And I realize there's irony even in my saying this, because I could be accused of saying, well, thank God I'm not self-righteous like all those self-righteous people who lost the gospel. I understand that. But so I think it's losing sight of the gospel. Isn't that astonishing? Paul retells it in Galatians 2, I think it is, where he comes and he confronts Peter of all people, and says, you're not living in line with the gospel. Peter lost the gospel. So I want to shine that theological light on it. It's just very, very easy, and it has happened millions of times, and it still happens within our own lives. And so I just think that's an important piece to remember in all of this.
Yeah, Randy, and as I think about what you're saying, I'm reminded of a point I was alluding to earlier that connects with this, which is people are either connected to the living God or they operate as independents. And when they operate as independents, they are saying, I don't need God. I don't recognize God. There are a lot of ways that we say it. I don't believe that there's a God, whatever it is. But when you have a world in which everyone is operating as a great independent, you have a lot of conflict. And that's the result that you get. Everyone's looking after their own identity, after their own rights, etc. They tend to care less about the person next to them unless it serves their interests, those kinds of things. So it's the seed for a whole lot of problems. I mean, the Bible calls it at the end, the idea that I'm a great independent is a form of idolatry. We turn ourselves into gods at the expense of the creator God, and in the process wreak a lot of collateral damage. Bible calls it all sin, but that's what it is. It's a messy collateral damage project that emerges as a result of our being independent or declaring ourselves as being the reality of the world, or whatever, however it manifests itself. And it is very, very damaging to lose the gospel.
Well, and I think, yeah, Tom, go ahead.
Joel, can I jump in here for a second? I can imagine somebody saying, well, this is shocking to hear about these Christian leaders who have even become anti-Semitic at points, or done this kind of thing, or the church persecuting the Jews in Spain, or who knows. I mean, there's so many things. How do you even take the gospel seriously when you look at this mess, the more you look at church history? I think it's a reasonable question. We need to kind of shift to the meta narrative, look at a bigger picture here, put it all in a different framework, and that is that the world that we are living in is a world of cosmic conflict, started at the Garden of Eden. There is an actual war going on between God and his angels and the devil and his minions. And when you become a believer, a true believer in Jesus, you leave that kingdom of rebellion and you come under the lordship of Jesus, and you enter a battle, a warfare against the world, the flesh, and the devil. The world being the fallen world, not the beautiful earth we know. We are in this kind of a struggle, and there are a lot of casualties, and it is a challenging situation to be in. And so what we see, if you look at the broad sweep of biblical, I mean, there are demonic kinds of activities going on in the Old Testament. Paul talks about it in the New Testament. We see it through church history. It's kind of like a sine wave. God comes and brings renewal, revival. The devil launches a counterattack. And so you have these periods where things surge forward with great strength, and wonderful things are happening through the power of the gospel. And then the counterattack comes, and then things go down beneath the baseline. And that has been going on, and people look at it, they don't know how to make sense of it, but it makes perfect sense if you start at the beginning of the Bible and realize what we're in, and we're headed toward a conclusion for all of this. But we need to become more, and I find evangelicals are just not that clued in about what we're talking about. We're so influenced by the secularism that has seeped into American culture and thinking, and by our materialism, by being wrapped up in the American dream and all these other things that distract us. And so, there's a blindness to what's going on. And we need to be awakened. And thank God for the kind of work that Daryl's been doing in the scriptures that help awaken us to the realities of discipleship. And so that is part of the solution here, that we really get better grounded in the scriptures and in the larger picture of what's going on. And anti-Semitism is one part of that and a significant part of it, but there's a lot more too that we need to wake up to and become part of the solution instead of part of the problem.
Well, that's a good place to turn to. I think earlier, Randy, you'd mentioned the fact that there even that, and you're alluding to this, Tom, the spiritual warfare and just that's going on. But there is a specific, it seems to be a specific attack against Jewish people throughout history, and perhaps tied to the fact that they're the ones, God chose Abraham and the Jewish people to bring the gospel to the world, and so there is something to that. So how can we respond as followers of Jesus Christ personally, first of all, to stand against anti-Semitism? And are there things that the church could do to better fight against this injustice of anti-Semitism? Randy, you'd like to start there?
Yeah, I'll dive in. So I think on a very interpersonal level, just one-on-one, this is a great opportunity for Christians to reach out to Jewish friends that they know and say, I just want you to know I'm really concerned. I'm really very disturbed about what's going on in the world, and I just want you to know that I'm not turning away from it. I'm looking at it. I'm very, very concerned. I want you to know I'm praying for the peace of Jerusalem, the way the scriptures tell us. I'm praying for people, Jewish people, Palestinian people. I'm praying that God does a miraculous work. How can I pray for you? I'm praying for your family. Many of us know Jewish people here who have relatives in Israel. I mean, I can think of several that I know. So I want to reach out to those people and say, hey, I'm not ignoring this. I'm very, very concerned about it. And then to follow it up really with indeed praying for these situations. I also want to say, Tom raised the question of, people may say, well, I mean, look at how Christians have done so terribly in the history of the church. I mean, why should I take this message seriously? And I think what we want to do in response and answer is to not deny it and not minimize it, but then to say, but despite all the horrible failures, I still think it's worth following Jesus. I still think he's beautiful. I think he's amazing. I think he is who he said he was, who he is. And I think the message of the New Testament, when it doesn't get distorted and manipulated, it's really a beautiful message. So I think it's still worth following, even in the midst of all the difficulties. I'll just say one more thing you said about the church. I would like to, I do hope that more and more churches are praying about this. And I mean, on Sunday morning as part of the Sunday morning gathering of worship. I think in pretty much every church, there's a time of prayer. I fear that some churches will want to we shouldn't mention this because people will think we're making a pro-Israeli stand or a pro-Palestinian stand, or we're trying to get involved in politics. And we need to avoid those problems for sure. But I think it would be great if people heard pastors and leaders and elders in the church say things like, Lord, please work and bring about peace in the Middle East. Bring about a revival. Draw people to yourself. May it be that Israelis and Palestinians and people all around the world will be drawn to you. I mean, pray those kinds of prayers. Those are not insignificant.
Daryl, you'd like to share something?
Yeah, my take is the opposite of the Nike commercial. Just don't do it. You know, don't do anything that reflects anti-Semitism. Don't do anything that promotes anti-Semitism. Speak out when you see it and say, address it. Just don't go there, and don't try your best to not allow anything to go there in the organizations that you're a part of and that kind of thing, because it's subtle. It can be subtle, and it needs to not be done. And that's actually just a good general rule for all our relationships with the various groups that we come across. There's so much hostility in our society today, drawn around various groups and the conflicts that we face, and we need a class of people that Jesus referred to in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers. We need more of those. So I don't know if it's a campaign slogan. Don't be an anti-Semite, be a peacemaker, and go in that direction.
I like what Daryl said. We've got
Yeah.
enough troublemakers. We need some peacemakers. But I think, getting to the text of Scripture for all this, Jesus told us, I am the way, the truth, and the life. We need to seek truth. We need to pray, God, show me the truth. Open my eyes to see. And we need to be agents of truth, to speak truth. And we need to do what Jesus said and what Moses recorded for us. Love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. And Jesus illustrated it in Luke 10, the Samaritan. How can we, in concrete, practical, love is not some emotional kind of buzz or something in the Bible. It's practical serving and helping people that are in need, doing for them what you'd want them to do for you if you were in their shoes. And that's very simple. There's nothing complicated at all about that. And so praying, God, help me to love you with all my heart and help me to love my neighbor. And to remember, too, that, we can't, there's not a back door that, okay, I'll love my neighbor, but I'm going to hate my enemies. I'm going to hate whoever our enemy happens to be.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus said, love your enemies, too. So we're kind of boxed in with Jesus and, become people of love. That's what we're called to be if we truly know Jesus.
Thanks for that, Tom. And I think, Tom, you shared a little bit how in your own story you were influenced by anti-Semitic materials, influenced by people who are pushing anti-Semitism, and eventually were somewhat indoctrinated, and unfortunately for a time were you got involved in that kind of mentality. But by seeking truth and finding Jesus, you were able to find healing and release and be freed from those anti-Semitic thoughts and tendencies and that worldview, and begin to be able to have good friendships with Jewish people. Perhaps Randy and Daryl, could you share maybe just personally in your own lives how anti-Semitism has impacted you individually, and how you've responded as a follower of Jesus Christ to anything that you've experienced in regard to this issue? Randy, you want to go first? Or?
Well, I saw it a whole lot growing up. I grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly not Jewish, but it was suburbs of New York, so there were lots of Jewish people. But I definitely knew that we were in the minority, and there were displays of it that were just very, very disturbing. I mean, I can't express it strongly enough, but so sort of like growing up with, oh, there are some people who really hate us, and I heard classmates say some things that were just very, very. They thought they were being funny, but it was terribly painful about Jewish people being cheap, and so I'm not quite sure how to answer your question. I guess the only other piece that I wanted to kind of enter in before the end of our discussion was that I mean, for me, this issue, this rise of anti-Semitism in the world, and people siding with anti-Semitism, it's very, very upsetting. It's very, very disturbing. I mean, we can talk sort of scholarly and intellectually, and we need to, but we can't ignore this is very, very sad and fearful. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Hitler was able to rouse millions of people to do crazy, irrational, systematic eliminating of people. 2/3 of the population of Jewish people in Europe were wiped out. 2/3 of Europe's Jews. There's nothing small about that. So when you hear today people downplaying that or denying that or repeating some of that, it's very, very upsetting. And we shouldn't ignore the emotional side of this, either the emotional irrationality of anti-Semitism or the emotionally sad and disturbing and fearful side of watching it rise. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I wanted to make sure that piece was expressed.
No, thank
In
you,
the
Randy.
Jewish community, there's one word that talks about, in one sense, how to remember or deal with anti-Semitism, and that is the word remember. Don't let the reality of what has taken place go off the radar. It's there. It's present. Be aware of it, and don't forget. Don't allow generations that didn't experience what you experienced or what you witnessed forget. I mean, that's part of what the Holocaust story is about, is that we're now moving into a generation that didn't experience the Holocaust directly. You have people who are trying to deny that it really took place, okay? And that's a lack of remembering what really took place and allowing that history to just kind of waft off into the air like a piece of mist. Don't do that. Make sure that people are aware, and podcasts like this is doing that. Make sure that people are aware, that they remember, that they see, that they sense that this is going on, that this is on the rise, that it is a problem, that it's a problem that plagues us. And anytime when we view a people this way, we create a problem for ourselves. And we need to be people who are sensitive to the fact that every individual who's ever been created has been made in the image of God and deserves respect.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful way, Daryl, just to kind of wrap up our discussion here. And just a few things that it seems in the responding to this Christian response to anti-Semitism, what I've heard from you all tonight is one, to love God, but also to love our neighbor as ourselves, to really live out the great commandment. I've heard the importance of reaching out then to our Jewish friends as an act of love and just saying that we care about them and what's going on, and we're disturbed by the rise of anti-Semitism. I've heard the importance of praying for our Jewish friends and others, praying for our enemies, praying for anyone who may be different from us, and are reaching out to them. And that's important then also lesson that Daryl's reminded us to remember. Sadly, we're called to remember since the evil in the world that it has taken place, so that it doesn't happen again. That we allow God's grace and truth and goodness to overcome the evil. And anti-Semitism has been an evil that's been going on for 3,000 years. And as Christians, it's our really duty to live out our calling and to be sure that we don't forget and that we do our best not to let it happen in our own personal lives and in the world. Thank you so much. Yes, Tom?
I have one final thought I'd like to share. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs addressed the European Parliament back in 2016, warning about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. And one of the comments, and you can probably find this on the internet, I think the title of his address is "What is Anti-Semitism?" But he made this statement: the persecution that begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews. And to follow that up is the story of a U-boat captain in World War I, Martin Niemöller, who was a celebrated German Navy officer. And when Hitler came to power, he opposed Hitler. He earlier actually liked some of the things Hitler was saying. But once he saw what Hitler was really about, he opposed Hitler and was put in prison for, I think, 7 or 8 years. But afterwards, and he became a pastor after he got out of prison, after the war ended. And there's a quote that is widely available. You can get it on the internet. Probably some listeners have heard it, but it bears repeating. And it goes this way. He said, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." That is something we need to take seriously today. There's a trajectory to what's going on. It's headed somewhere. And we need to stand up and be faithful to Jesus and not miss the opportunity or fail our responsibilities in this hour.
Thank you for that, Tom. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Daryl, for being with us. And thank you, Randy. I really appreciate each one of you and your time with us as we've discussed this topic. And our hope and prayer is that all of you watching will take time to reflect upon this topic and ask the Lord, what is your response to be to this sin of anti-Semitism in your personal life and in the world? Thank you for joining us. May God bless you. And we'll continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem and the peace of this world. God bless.